Hi, Neil from EA Media here again. Most people want to jump right into talking about security controls, but I wanted to make sure that you had the basis of the standard architecture that you fit those controls into. Now that we've talked about that, let's talk security controls in your individual zones.
By the way, if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. That way you can help grow the EA Media community. Okay, I've talked about a method to organize your security zones. I've talked about logically grouping your assets into those security zones. But there's one thing that still needs to be talked about: security controls. By isolating your assets into like-for-like classifications, you can ensure that all security controls are consistent for each one of those assets. And that allows you to lessen the risk of a pass-through from one security zone to another zone by hopping common infrastructure. But that is all passive security. It's about having an architecture that ensures that things work. But you still have your active security that you have to think about. And for me, that's when I start using my reference security architecture. I use my reference security architecture so that I don't forget about potential things that I can do to lessen risk. Not all security solutions are owned by each of my clients, so there's a checklist that I use to say, can we use this? Can we use that? In essence, you could say your reference security architecture, or your checklist, is your first security control. It's easy to forget things, so if you have a checklist, you can be consistent in your application of security controls. The first thing to think about in applying your security controls in security zones is to think about what level of controls are needed. Do public information need the same level of authentication as highly confidential? Can you have different logging requirements for different security classifications? So think about whether each level of classification needs the same level of security controls. It's the lazy security person that applies the same controls for everything. So what to look at first? Well, I have yet to see any solution that doesn't have authentication and authorization, so let's talk about that. Authentication can come down to anonymous, username, password, two-factor authentication, federation, single sign-on, local accounts versus domain accounts, and so on. By the way, notice I included anonymous? I learned a long time ago that sometimes no decision is a good decision. Well, the same goes for authentication. When you talk about authorizations, you end up talking about roles. You want to ensure that you follow the guidance associated with the principle of least privilege and have different roles for different functions. General user, application administrator, IT administrator, and owner are good places to start. But don't limit yourself and try to use the same roles across all devices. This is the basis of role-based access control if you want to go down that path. Next is encryption. I haven't talked about data in flight versus data at rest to this point because both have a heavy dependency on encryption. So decide if your classification needs encryption and where. There's things like database tables and specific information in the database that can be encrypted. You can also encrypt data as it goes from one location to another. And that also goes for the need for a VPN tunnel of some sort when you're going from one zone to another. Use a set of approved encryption algorithms, and I would recommend don't make your own, but use NIST's approved list. It saves you time and you don't have to continuously manage it. Okay, next is logging. The more important the information or the more at risk the asset is to compromise, the more you want to log. Something in the DMZ that it was publicly facing is something that I want to log everything on. But then the logging requirements go down immediately afterwards and then climb as the classification goes up. Now, data at rest basically comes down to endpoint protection. You'll have your malware protection on your infrastructure to look for new viruses and such. You'll have a personal firewall on those individual devices because, let's face it, not everyone hardens boxes properly. And you can have a whitelisting solution in place if you want. There are so many different controls you can put into place that you have to really consider what each individual security classification needs. And remember, there are costs associated with these controls, so don't throw in things just to do security. Give some thought into what is needed before saying to a solution architect that they need to do something. If you can justify for each individual classification, you can win your conversations much more easily. Well, that's it for this video. If you like this video, take a look at these other videos we have on our site, including these two. I'm Neil Rarup with EA Media, and I hope that helps.